Welcome. Just wanted to, before I hand it over to Sarath to introduce our speaker, just wanted to welcome you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to CASI. I know all of you, so I'm not going to introduce myself, but well, maybe online. I'm Tariq Tachil, the director of CASI, and we're delighted to be able to do some stuff in person after a long absence of in-person events and mostly doing stuff virtually, which we have now retained. But it's just great to see people actually using this table for purposes other than me taking a nap. So thank you all again for coming. And I just wanted to highlight that we have 3 new postdocs here at CASI this year, new members of the CASI community. Amrita Kurian, I don't know if you guys can see her. There she is, she's waving. So Amrita Kurian is an anthropologist who's joined us from UCSD. And she works on a number of topics relating to agrarian social relations. Sarath Pillai is a historian who's joined us from Chicago and works on the history of Indian federalism and many other topics relatedly. And Shikhar Singh over there, who's staring at his mug of tea, is a political scientist who's joined us from Yale and works on questions of distributive politics and now on India's small towns. And so just delighted to have them all join our community, and they, especially Sarath and Amrita, are really curating this series. So thanks to them for all their organizational work. I'll turn it over to Sarath to introduce Priya, our speaker.
Well, thank you, Tariq, for that. So the speaker for today is Priya Mukherjee, and we are extremely delighted to be able to host her here. And today's talk is held in partnership with 4 other units on campus. So they are the Department of Economics, Penn Institute for Economic Research, and Penn Development Research Initiative, and the South Asia Center. So we are extremely grateful to all of them for co-sponsoring this talk. Priya Mukherjee is an assistant professor at the Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is basically a development economist with a focus on human capital and political economy. She's an accomplished author and academic who's published many research papers, including in journals like the Review of Economics and Statistics, Econometrica, and the Journal of Development Economics. In fact, I actually recommend you visit her personal website, where you will find a lot of her current projects as well as previous published papers. So she also taught at the College of William and Mary before joining Wisconsin. And today she'll be speaking to us about a very important topic, which is how do people behave electorally or react electorally, even in the face of economic policies that don't make any sense, seemingly. The title of her talk is Political Accountability for Populist Policies, Lessons from the World's Largest Democracy. Before I hand over to Priya, just a word about the law and order situation in the room. So she'll speak for about 30 to 35 minutes. And she's also happy to be interrupted while she speaks and take questions, which she will do herself. There will be a Q&A, which I'll moderate after the talk. And if you're online, the recommended way to ask questions is by typing it in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. And my colleague Amrita will read out. Over to you.
So I'm visible. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to UPenn. This is my first visit, so I'm really happy to be here. It's great to be here at CASI, and I believe this is your first in-person seminar, so that's really exciting. It's my second in-person seminar since 2020, so it's exciting for me as well. Really happy to present this joint work with Gaurav Khanna, who's my really great co-author at UCSD. And as the title maybe doesn't completely suggest, or maybe does suggest, and as Sarath mentioned, we're looking at how voters respond to a specific type of policy that was implemented in India in particular. This is India's demonetization, and we're going to look at the electoral effects of it. Okay, so I'll just get started right away. I think I'm not able to.
Slide if you've done a Zoom next time. Use the mouse to click on top of the slide.
No, it's not moving.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'll just use this. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are just some of the newspaper headlines that came out right after demonetization. And I will, for those of you in the room that maybe don't remember or aren't completely familiar, but I'm guessing most of you did hear of this. This was something that happened in November of 2016. Demonetization was suddenly announced by the PM, and essentially It was a very sudden announcement, unexpected. That was announced on TV, which invalidated 86% of currency in circulation in the country, in a country where most economic transactions, at least at that point in time, were done in cash.
So Priya, that's 86% of the value of currency or of the number of currency notes?
The value, yeah. So actually, I should say, yeah, 86%, yeah, of value of currency. And I forget what fraction of economic transactions, but a really, really large fraction. Yeah, so essentially what happened was that 500 and 1,000 rupee notes were invalidated, essentially overnight. There was issuance of new 500 and 2,000 rupee notes in exchange for these older currency notes, and one could draw up to 4,000 per person per day at that time, although there were some changes in these rules that were announced throughout the next several weeks. There's a paper by Abhijit Banerjee and co-authors where they did an information RCT in one part of India, where in their appendix, they really lay out all of the changes in the rules that occurred, the takeaway being that this was a fairly confusing time, in addition to the fact that getting cash out, depositing and getting cash out was really challenging soon after this happened. And you were supposed to deposit notes by the end of the year. What was the goal of this? Now, I should say that this type of demonetization or this demonetization in general is not, something that's that uncommon. So, for example, in the EU, when countries transitioned into the euro, some sort of demonetization happened, right? Especially when you're bringing in different types of bills. What was unique about this was its sudden and drastic, the way it was implemented. So what could have been the goal of this? So this is the government's stated goal, and in the TV announcement that happened that evening, this was stated, not just that evening, but also in the subsequent weeks, that this is done to curtail the shadow economy, fight terrorism, tackle counterfeit currency. And as I will show you, a lot of voters likely did agree with this, and there was actually broad support for this policy, despite all of the negative impacts that happened immediately after. So for instance, as one might expect, the stock market crashed the next day, GDP growth projections were lowered. And this is just a photo from one of the newspapers where, this is a really large market in Delhi called Connaught Place. You can see the lines, and this was a story in most parts of the country where there were bank branches to make lines outside of places where you have less access to bank branches. That's even more challenging. So there were like lots of people, academics, or Kaushik Basu used to be the chief economic advisor, people like him and others that anticipated that this would lead to huge economic costs. Our focus in this paper is on the electoral consequences, and I'll talk about how we get at the causal effects and how we look at electoral consequences, but I will also give you a sense of what the immediate economic impacts were. That's not a focus of this paper, but there have been other papers, and we also look into that a little bit before getting into the electoral consequences. So anecdotally, what was happening if you were just following politics in the, for example, in 2017, if you're looking at state elections that were taking place, the BJP, which is the government's, the Prime Minister's party, was doing fairly well. And if you just look at, for example, the states between 2014 and 2017, just two different snapshots, you can see the number of states just switching from being ruled by other parties to being ruled by BJP or its coalition. So, without objectively, collecting data and really looking into this carefully, you might think that, maybe this particular policy maybe helped the BJP. Well, I'll show you soon what we find. But this was some of the stuff that, people were saying. So, for example, the Gujarat chief minister said elections for the Gram Panchayats were held immediately after demonetization. 80% of the Gram Panchayats were won by the BJP. Thereafter, elections were held in Maharashtra and BJP won. Congress stepped away. Clearly shows that Congress does not enjoy people's support on the issue of demonetization. Okay. So despite negative economic consequences, the policy was actually popular. So, in addition to the anecdotes, We looked at data from a survey run by CSDS in Delhi called the Mood of the Nation survey. And this is a survey that we do use in our analysis as well. The survey was conducted in May 2017, and respondents, the nationally representative data set, were asked what they thought of demonetization. So in that data, 16% felt that it was a bad policy, 45% thought it was a good policy, and 32% thought it was a good policy that could have been implemented better. So there was broad appeal. And why there might be this broad appeal, one can think of different things. It could be a combination of the policy's moral appeal, tackling counterfeit money, going after terrorism, and so on. And also there was quite a bit of strong messaging undertaken by a broadly popular prime minister. And indeed, like I had mentioned, the messaging was framed as one, the policy was framed as one that would combat corruption and black money, which turns out were popular concerns of the electorate. What's happening on the economic side, though, the central bank has shown, by Amartya Lahiri, he has a paper on this, that such objectives, tackling black money and moving away from misusing cash, these objectives were not actually met. Instead, what happened was soon after, the policy led to severe shortages in access to cash and negative economic effects. Okay, so what does our paper try to get at? We try to see, using the methods that I'll describe very soon, was to see if the Prime Minister's party was actually hurt in regions that had more severe demonetization. So we're going to use variation in severity of demonetization to see if places with more severe demonetization reacted differently. So how do we define that? So we're going to specifically look at regions with fewer banks. So we're claiming that regions with fewer access to banks were more adversely affected because the access to cash was even more curtailed in those places. And in such places, did the voters punish the party that implement the policy? And are there other factors that garner support for the policy despite it, hurting economically? So specifically, what do we do? How do we get this variation in severity of demonetization? We leverage a policy experiment. So we're really going to get at causal effects of demonetization by using this variation. So we go back in history, and we find that in 2005, and we're not the first to use this, as another paper that had used it to look at a different research question. The opposition party, the Congress, had implemented a policy, more than a decade earlier, that increased access to banking facilities and, therefore cash as well, by encouraging private sector banks and just generally banks to enter certain types of districts. In particular, there was some, quasi-random variation. In particular, there was a discontinuity that was used. So I'll get into the details of this a little bit, but essentially districts whose number of banks per person was less than the national average got more banks, and other districts did not. Okay, so describing it very briefly, districts on one side of that threshold should arguably be similar to districts on the other side of the threshold, at least back when this policy was implemented. And if we compare those two kinds of districts, they're likely very similar on average, and that's the control and treatment approach that we're taking. So we're going to use an RD design, and actually we're going to use a difference in discontinuity design, which I'll describe in just a moment.
So were private banks encouraged generally, or were they particularly encouraged in areas that had little banking?
Only in areas that had lower banks. So districts so they changed the policies and rules. There was lots of red tape in them entering. So in districts that had that were just below the threshold, actually all districts below the threshold had easier banks had easier access for entry. Okay, so before going to the details of how we do what we do, I'll give you a preview of the findings. After demonetization, the implementing policy, the Prime Minister's party, in more severe or less banked regions with more severe demonetization, his party did have lower vote share. So the BJP was hurt in those places. We also show along the way that those places had worse economic outcomes, even though that's not a focus of our paper. There's other work on this. In those places with more severe demonetization, there was less support for the policy. There's electoral effects, and we see significant heterogeneous effects. So there were some places that were completely unresponsive. Even though they were economically hurt, they did not, vote any less for the BJP. Okay. What kinds of places are these? These are political strongholds, or basically places that have had support for BJP in the past, and I'll tell you how we define strongholds. But essentially, in places that have historically had support for the BJP, there were actually muted or no impacts in electorally as a result of more severe demonetization. These are essentially places where voters are more aligned on just the policy bundle that this party has. And the possible explanation, and we can't directly test for this, is that there's issue bundling in contexts like this in democracies where you're voting for just a party rather than for a particular policy. You're going to vote for the party in any case. Okay, so that's our guess. That's likely what's happening here. And we look at other things like incumbency, voting for the incumbent, or whether it affects on turnout. We don't see anything there. And given that this is a slightly shorter presentation, I won't spend much time on the literature here, so I'll likely just skip it. In any case, this was not an exhaustive list of all of the relevant literature, but there is a really large literature, I guess, growing on how voters respond to different kinds of fiscal policy, populist policy. I think we're framing this as a populist policy in the sense it was popular, whereas it was not really. It actually materially hurt voters. There's some growing work on this in economics, and there's likely more in political science and other disciplines as well. So I'll jump straight into the empirical strategy. So as an economist, getting at the causal effect using data is sort of very key. It's really important. So in general, what we want to do is have quasi-random or plausibly exogenous variation in this variable, which is exposure to demonetization or severity of demonetization, and see the effect of that on voter behavior. This is not the specification we have. This is just like a toy model of what we would like to get at. So that's what we need exogenous variation in. And the way we get at that, like I had mentioned, is we look at variation in access to banks, cash, or ATMs. And we're leveraging this banking reform that the Congress, the opposition party, had implemented several years ago that made bank branch licensing much easier in underbanked districts. What is an underbanked district? The district where the branches per person is less than the national average. So it's a sharp discontinuity. And so we use that. But in addition, because since 2005, maybe these two types of districts might have evolved in different ways, we additionally want to do a pre-post difference. We have data on elections before demonetization, after demonetization on both types of districts. So differences across districts, and also difference out any pre-existing differences. And that's what I'm calling a difference in discontinuity. Yeah?
I just want to clarify, so you have districts where there are fewer banks, and then you have the national average, and then districts where there are more banks. And it's districts that have fewer than the national average got the policy for bank expansion. So it's actually what's on the other side of this continuity that are districts with fewer banks.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And that's a great question, because when I show you the graphs and the regressions, it can be a little bit confusing. That's exactly right. Yeah, and so we're going to use difference in discontinuity, and this same banking reform has been looked at in this paper by Young, who used it in his thesis at BU, and he found some economic effects. Yeah?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
So could you just speak to the importance of banks as a way of disseminating cash in rural areas? Because, for example, like in Manrega, sometimes they use individuals who carry cash to villages to disperse against an Aadhaar authentication, rather than people meeting at a focal point like a bank to do this. So was it an important way of disseminating cash to begin with?
Yeah, so I don't recall exact numbers on this, but it is the primary way, especially if you want to deposit old currency notes
Yeah.
and then withdraw that type of transaction, you really need a bank branch. I mean, there is to some extent you could do this in maybe in post offices, but banks were really key. So yeah, that's why we feel, sort of relatively convinced.
And there was no discontinuity in post office coverage.
No, yeah, this
in
was
the
just
design.
purely, exactly. So nothing else should be different around the threshold.
And I know you looked at this in the paper, just to remind everyone, so did you find good compliance with this in terms of, was it that there was also some kind of favoritism at play in where the licenses were granted, or some other factor that determined the distribution of
Yeah.
where the banks came up?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I do have a few slides which I will likely go over quickly. I won't spend too much time, but that's a really important point. Did this policy actually have bite? Was there good enforcement? It was very good enforcement. So, not only were there effects like banks coming in right after 2005, there was growth over time, and in 2016, there's a significant discontinuity still. And in terms of favoritism, we did not specifically look at that, but what we see is compliance is very, very high.
Yeah,
And the favoritism would have been around Congress, likely because Congress was the party implementing it. And that's why we prefer the difference in discontinuity.
totally. I think it may just be helpful to know, because you look at just compliance with the rule, but
Mhm.
whether there's any other basis where you could maintain compliance with the population threshold, but still have
Yeah.
some other dimension that determine and just
Yeah.
what the implication would be, just even having a note
Yeah.
on that. You may not be able to have data on
Yeah.
that, but I think it would be nice to know.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. And we use the intent to treat in any case.
Yeah.
So
And this is just the voting, the vote shares are from state or national?
state.
Okay,
We look
so-
at national as well, but if I have time to talk about, there's issues with national, with matching parliament,
Right,
mental
yeah.
and then you're less powered, so you're less powered, we find the price a little bit noisy, yeah, that's a good question.
So in practice, does this mean that the places that were initially underbanked then come to look like the ones that were not underbanked by the time? So like, does this essentially mean that across India, things are relatively even, or
No.
that they just haven't, again?
Yeah, so the places that got the banks, they got significantly more by the time we look at them. Yeah, 2016.
Okay, so they knew that you're right, so it's flipped by.
It's
the end.
flipped.
Okay,
It's
that
totally
was-
flipped.
They become overbanked by national standards. But-
Yes, by
yeah,
national standards.
By
yes.
national standards, yeah.
So would we expect there to be more use of currency if there are more banks or if there are less banks?
So the thing that we're using here is that if there's more banks, they are able to deposit the old currency notes and bring and take out the new currency notes. So right after demonetization happened, the ease of transitioning was just better for people that have. I mean, that's so in general in terms of transactions later. That's a question mark. It depends on how many people are switching to more digital payments, which is also something that occurred later.
It might be in the underbanked areas, currency per capita, once you control for income or whatever, is much higher because you couldn't use the banks.
Yeah, there might have been some differences. That's right, because this paper did find some differences around the threshold, which is why we really rely on the difference in discontinuity. Yeah.
So, did you have a sense of the liquor market, because they were allowed to accept old currency notes during this
no.
interim period?
Okay.
But like they could be a set of people who were allowed to accept
I
currency
see.
in old denomination. So if the exposure to liquor markets is asymmetric, there may be a kind of.
Okay. Yeah, I do not have data on that, and that's not
Yeah,
something that I looked at. Okay, yeah, maybe that's something that might be going on, although not. Yeah, we still believe our
Yeah.
estimates and all that, but that's an interesting point. I had not thought of that. Okay, so I won't again spend too much time on data. I'll just say that we have banking data. It's publicly available. The list of districts, there is a memo essentially that has the list of districts that were supposed to get more banks, and that's the data that we actually use. Then we use this other data to look at the first stage, like did the policy actually have bite and so on. And then we have election data also publicly available. We create variables on coalitions and things like this. We have data on nightlights in the months around demonetization, and then this survey is really nice. It's called the Mood of the Nation. It's from May 2017, where they ask specific questions about support for Modi, economic conditions, banking access, and the important one for us is actual views on demonetization. You have a question? Okay, so this was the question that was asked. What does the first stage look like? So places that had, everything's normalized to 0, that's basically the threshold. You don't have banks, so you are far more likely to get more, or to be assigned to be considered an unbanked district. So this is based on the actual list that was in the memo. And then we look at other things as well. So for example, around the cutoff, again, this is the same thing, just a table format, just showing that you're considered unbanked if indeed you're below the average. And then we look at actual new branches, like growth in branches, and those were all significantly higher. And we have more in the paper. Now the paper is currently under revision, so we've added even more things for our referees, showing that yes, the policy had bite all the way to 2016. And then we go further to show that the banking policy actually did increase access to banks. And I won't spend much time on this, but essentially this is just showing that places on left of the threshold had a lot more growth in branches relative to places just on the other side of the threshold. Number of accounts, credit limit, everything was significantly different. Okay. And similarly, we also wanted to see how it looks in the CSDS data, which is the voter survey. They were asked questions also about having a bank account or post office account or debit or credit card. It's possible that between demonetization and May 2017, they got some of these things because they were more badly affected. So it's possible this is a combined effect. But this one also shows that around the cutoff, there are significant differences in the survey data as well. So that's all sort of preliminary before I want to show you before getting to the electoral effects. But along the way, we did do some more work just to check a few things. So for example, the Congress, the other party was the one that did the banking expansion policy. Were there any electoral effects of that? My prior was that, probably not, because when a private bank comes in, it's not salient to the voters' mind that, oh, here's a private bank, Congress is responsible. That's likely not what happened. And this is a policy that the Congress never even campaigned on. So, we find nothing. So essentially, for district received banks, the Congress or the coalition UPA is not any more likely to, win elections, and nothing happens to vote shares as well.
Was there any evidence of impact on the economy?
Yes, so that's not our paper, that's the other paper by Young, I think Nathaniel Young, and he found some impact in rural areas.
Congress.
Exactly, so this policy, we found, we came across it someplace, but then he wrote a paper first as part of his dissertation review. And so there's no discontinuity, just pre-demonetization as well on vote shares in the pre-period. And like I was saying, why was the Congress party not rewarded? Maybe gains manifest over time, but it's really not salient. Maybe voters don't know how to attribute the credit, but that's not something we can really identify in our paper. There's other work looking at the economic impacts of demonetization, using different kinds of identification strategies. We wanted to make sure that we can replicate some of those results using our sample and our identification strategy. So similar to some other work that Geeta Gopinath and others have done, we do find that economic activity as proxied by nightlights was less or was worse in places with more severe demonetization as defined by us. So we do a difference in discontinuity looking at monthly nightlight data before and after demonetization around that threshold for districts, and this is the specification that we have. And what we find is that places with more banks after demonetization will have relatively more economic activity, if you believe nightlights as a proxy for it, as others have done. So now that brings me finally to the electoral effects, and I think I'm maybe have 10 more minutes. So 5 more minutes.
Okay. yeah,
Okay,
right.
so I'll try to like rush through the main effects. So we have this data on, was demonetization the right move? Do they like the policy? And so on. We did some descriptive work that I won't spend much time on, what are the correlates of support? This is this is a regression with, support on the left-hand side with all of these on the right-hand side, so it's conditional. You can run these separately as well, but it's fairly consistent that, it was a little surprising to me. I actually thought that if you're a formal sector worker, maybe you would support it more relative to informal, but that's not really what we see. It's some of these other, religiosity and religion that seem to correlate with support for the policy. So before going to electoral effects, we want to look at voter views. And what we find is that voters, so this is just a cross section. We can't do difference and discontinuity here because we only have that one point in time it was measured, what the voter views were in May 2017. This one's a little bit noisy, but what this shows is that around the cutoff, voters that were less badly or that had more banks, so less severe demonetization, were more likely to say, this is a good policy relative to people that were worse hit. And it's the opposite if the person is saying that it was done with bad preparation.
What about if they just said it was bad?
It was, I think, similar. It was negative. It was just a much smaller fraction, so it's a little bit noisier.
So the difference between the two columns on bandwidth,
The difference is that these two, yes, that's right.
And these are
Yeah.
MSE optimal bandwidth?
So this one is not, so the straight RD, we are doing different types of optimal bandwidth, including MSC.
Yeah.
This one, we just made it consistent with our electoral results. So remember, the electoral results are difference and discontinuity, for which I'm not aware of any method to choose optimal bandwidths. So for those we use these, and I'll show you robustness to different bandwidths for those results as well. So this particular table is consistent with what we have there, but we could do optimal with this one as well, since this is a cross section. Okay, finally, was the BJP punished for demonetization? The answer is yes. They got relatively fewer votes, and effect sizes were significant. So this is a specification we have, which I won't repeat again. It's a difference in discontinuity. And this is not the difference in discontinuity table. This is just looking at differences around the cutoff in changes as the outcome variable. And just visually, what you will see is, if you got more banks, or if you have less banks and more severe demonetization, the BJP is essentially less likely to win. But maybe this one is a little bit easier. So here you have the optimal bandwidths, but this is not our preferred specification. This is just the simple difference, it's simple RD. So if you receive more banks, you're more likely to vote for the BJP or an ally. On the flip side, if you received less banks, more severe demonetization, you're going to punish BJP.
Can you give a sense of the, well, okay, do these actually first, yeah, that's fine. No, you can go ahead.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, it's fine.
Okay, yeah, so we have vote shares, we have probabilities, the difference in discontinuity. So this is our most conservative estimate, essentially. So vote shares for BJP is higher with less severe demonetization, or you can say lower with more severe demonetization by almost 5 percentage points, and then it's even higher if you look at coalition, vote shares for coalition. Probability of winning is also pretty large effects, I would say. You wanted to give a sense of what's happening before demonetization. We don't have a whole lot of elections afterwards. And because you have very few elections per year, very few states, we group them in bundles of years, and it's relatively flat before, so we're happy to see that. And the last thing I'll say is that our results are robust to different things, bandwidth selection. We do different falsification tests, just set 2014 randomly as a demonetization year and just run the same analysis. We don't see anything there. We include, constituencies based on how the outcome variable is defined. So if a party doesn't field a candidate, do you treat that as 0 vote share, or do you treat that as missing? We do it both ways. it's fine, and then it's robust, and then we also, this is the most recent thing, it's not in the paper yet, we did it for our revisions, we do different types of fixed effects. And there's reasons to think, this could matter, and our results are robust to this as well. So this is just showing for different bandwidths what's happening to the effects. As you would expect for the smallest bandwidth, it just gets a lot more noisy. Okay. And the very last thing I'll say is, nothing happened in strongholds, right? So in strongholds, so this is a difference in discontinuity with a further difference where we're interacting with whether a constituency, is a stronghold or not, coalition versus BJP, and it's essentially wiping out, any differences that were coming from the severity of demonetization. And we have some conjectures on why this might be the case, but the way we're defining strongholds, it's actually a fairly large fraction of the country. And what this is saying is for big chunks of the country, even if you're negatively impacted, which we check for, so if you're in a stronghold with more severe demonetization, less night lights, and what we've looked into now for our revisions is, it's not the case you're getting more, Narega jobs, it's not the case that you're getting other transfers, you are negatively impacted, but you're still not responding electorally to being economically hurt.
How was this operationalized?
Which one? Yeah, so in this particular, so we can do it in different ways. So for these estimates, I simply looked at the number of BJP wins or NDA wins pre-demonetization, and I just split it into above and below median, sorry.
At the assembly constituency level?
Yes, yeah. So I just split into above and below median, so it's a split. You could do it in different ways, and it's actually not very different. And yeah.
All ACs in a district basically got assigned the district score of the.
No, so this is by AC, so on the left, so the data is at the AC level, the treatment is at the district by your level.
Right,
Yeah,
but so
yeah.
all ACs are basically assigned to that. I mean, all
No, so
ACs
it's
in a
AC by
district-
AC
yeah.
actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if that particular AC is the number of wins in that AC.
Oh, no, I'm saying in terms of the
banks.
treatment, the banking thing was for all ACs in that
Exactly,
district,
sorry,
basically
yeah.
treated the same. Yeah,
Exactly,
okay, yeah,
exactly, yeah. So all the ACs have the
Yeah.
exact same treatment,
Right.
and that's an assumption that we made.
And
Right.
cluster by the district.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and like I was saying, night lights, it's not the case that the interactions are any different. They're also impacted, the strongholds are also impacted, and so on. So I'll just end by sort of summarizing and a few conjectures on why we don't see much on strongholds. Maybe that's open for future research. But to summarize, what we did was we used a regression discontinuity design, and furthermore a difference in addition to that, to look at the electoral effects of this fairly popular policy, based on all of the data we saw. In fact, the fractions were much larger than my priors. And it had significant economic costs, at least in the short run, even if they've gone away over time. The ruling party had growing support on average, but relatively speaking, they had significantly less support, as we showed, in districts with less access to cash or banks. And it's a little bit ironic because the ruling party rewarded, the BJP was rewarded more in districts with more banks, and they had more banks because of the opposition's policy a decade prior. And so this one had, we see electoral effects, this one not. I don't think we're underpowered on this, likely because salience matters, but we can't definitively say anything on that. And then finally, the impacts were driven by non-stronghold areas, or areas that had not much history of BJP support. And again, we're conjecturing that policy spaces are multidimensional and citizens get one vote. So that's likely, and if you're more aligned, you're not going to be as responsive to one particular policy like this. And then finally, like I mentioned, we looked at some other standard things one could look at, and these results are not being driven by turnout or incumbents or anything like this. And this question was asked in national elections. We find similar but very noisy effects on national elections, and that's not too surprising given all of the issues and the assigning treatment to parliamentary constituencies. Okay, thank you. Thanks for all the questions.
Well, we have a good 20 minutes at least, so please have a go if you want to ask questions.
This might be more of an interpretation question, but as I understood it, the districts that got a lot of banks were also growing faster. And if you're growing faster, then your economic circumstances are improving markedly over time. And so then you might be less sensitive to a negative shock than you would be if you hadn't been growing fast. And so in a way, it seems like that would be very correlated then with the policy that you have, which makes it a little hard to know whether it's access to the bank to change out your cash, or it's that you're just hurt less by the policy in the sense that you don't notice its impact as much on you because you feel richer.
Yeah, so we had like, I didn't talk as much about it. So the difference around the card before after difference and some controls, district fixed effects would get at some of this, but not,
growth, though.
not,
It wouldn't-
yeah,
it
but
would get a
not
level,
growth.
it would get a
Yeah,
slope.
yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
don't think it matters fundamentally to the end result. I think what it does is alter the interpretation.
It
of
does,
what's
yeah.
able to get there.
Yeah, depending on how much that.
The BJP thing also helps you rule out maybe a little bit, but like one way you could test that is to see whether those strongholds are economically better off or not, because if not, then it would argue against what I just said as a channel.
Yeah, we can look more into what's happening to growth across the different kinds of districts. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. Could you help us really understand the political impact of what the result is? So in the paper, you say that a 10% decrease in bank branches is associated with a 0.9 percentage point increase in BJP's vote share. So what was the typical discontinuity in bank branches in the country, and what was the BJP's winning margin? Because a 1% decrease in the BJP's vote share in 2014 and 19 does not, I don't think it would have moved the needle all that much.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I always find it challenging to think about what difference it makes when you're forming a government, especially in a place like India where there's so much coalitions happening. I don't have a very good answer for it. I mean, you can get a sense of like what's happening to probability of a candidate winning here, but how this translate to, and I would love to hear ideas on this for not just this project but all my other projects as well. How do you translate probability of winning to what's happening at in state governments and also like at the state level, if you were to look at something more aggregated, we're currently totally underpowered.
May I give a
Yeah,
suggestion?
yeah,
So
sure.
it seems your stronghold measure is basically capturing Western India. Because if you look at prolonged incumbency for the BJP since, let's say, 1999, then the states are probably like areas where it has a straight contest with the Congress. So maybe one story that's going on here is where you don't have a credible opposition. The voters don't punish even a bad policy. And wherever there is some semblance of contest, there seems to be a punishment. So maybe the splitting variable is not so much party stronghold, but like effective or credible opposition. And you may see that there's like heterogeneity on that count.
Yeah, I think, that's a really interesting point because it comes to how we're interpreting this heterogeneity itself, right? So what is it about the stronghold? So we did something similar on, if the state is a BJP ruled state, we find similar effects. If maybe, if you're right, then if you look at, is there a strong opposition and we put it up that, maybe we'll get something similar. So what we have not done in this paper and we aren't able to do properly, maybe we could do it in future, is unpack the stronghold really carefully, which we haven't done.
So I guess on that, this is something I was thinking about. I mean, one of the way, sort of my intuition on how to interpret the stronghold is in some sense, these are places where you perhaps have fewer sort of like elastic voters who are willing to sort of switch back and forth, especially if we think about 2009 was a really bad election for the BJP. So if we think about there's a pretty short period in which a lot of people are shifting sort of at the national level, but broadly in a lot of states as well, right? A lot of people are shifting to the BJP prior to demonetization. And so if we think it's precisely in not strongholds, and weak holds, if you will, that you see more of this recent shift, it seems plausible that those are the people that are much more willing to then shift back in response to this, as opposed to places where there's a stronghold where sort of there's a pretty deep core of support, especially support pretty high. So I would sort of interpret it sort of the share of the electorate that's relatively elastic and sort of therefore responsive to these types of things. And then I guess somewhat related, maybe not. In terms of the framing, guess sort of, as I read the first couple of pages, sort of this idea of the framing of a populist or sort of a popular policy, I guess sort of thinking about a lot of the work on public opinion that shows sort of how much like partisan identity shapes attitudes on issues, particularly new and relatively complex ones. I guess I would approach sort of the responses on something like this cross-sectional survey with a healthy dose of skepticism that that's getting at a real, genuine preference, and it's not just reflecting underlying support for Modi, especially given when you talk about, right, it wasn't actually sort of economic things that, right, sort of the formal sector, it was stuff that seems like it's pretty strongly correlated with Modi support.
Yes.
And so just in terms of thinking about how you frame the paper,
Yeah.
I actually thought it equally, a different but equally interesting framing would be sort of like, what is the impact of bad policies from popular politicians?
Yes,
Right,
yes,
so it's
yeah.
not the
Yeah.
populism per se, but I think it's still getting at this idea of like sort of,
Yeah.
how much latitude do popular politicians
Yeah.
have to essentially do things that harm voters?
Yeah.
And I think your answer is basically in places where that policy is really, where that leader is extremely popular, there are pretty minimal effects. In places where maybe some of that sort of support is a bit shallower in the sense that more people that have recently switched, there are in fact some electoral effects.
Yeah.
To me,
That's
kind of
really helpful.
that's sort
Yeah.
of, I think that to me that's you're on a little more solid
Yeah.
footing,
Yeah.
and you're not sort of worried.
Yeah.
Anyway, someone could come on and say like, well, I don't think there's a real attitude note, but that's fine. Like that's sort of not.
Yeah.
We're not hanging our hats on that in the way that
Yeah.
I worry a little bit that sort of the current framing.
Yeah.
You really sort of have to buy the idea that people really like this policy.
Yes.
When I think
Yeah.
it's all you need to do is accept that they buy that Modi said it was a good policy.
Yeah, that's actually really helpful because we're currently in the process of revising the introduction. So it's like, that's really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Speaking mentioned.
Oh, sorry, Rashi first, because you had your hand and then.
Sorry, yeah, so I had one thought, I don't know if it's actually relevant or useful, but a lot of the conversation around demonetization was also how it like cleaned out the Congress's coffers, because the BJP had like time in the run-up, to like sort out their black money, whereas the Congress didn't. So I just in relation to like Shikhar's point about, strongholds and like where Congress was able to perform better versus where it wasn't. Like, I don't know if there's any measures of like how much the Congress was able to spend, but something like that, I don't know, might be useful to unpack the stronghold.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a general point that's like always hovering in the back, because that was a claim that was made, right? Like, oh, there was one of the reasons why this happened, etc. I mean, if that is happening, like a boring response is that, oh, that would like go against our results, so likely the results are even greater because, I don't know, I don't have good ideas on how to get it. I mean, there's probably suggestive things one can look at, like are, for example, Congress candidates like less likely to run for re-election because now they have less access to cash. Those are things one could look at.
But I also have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, the BJP has really changed how like elections function, and like demonetization is an interesting time because it's around that time where things are changing. But historically, like how people vote at the state level versus how people vote at the national level is different. So you're measuring state assembly elections. I'm curious about like, I mean, it's not obvious, right, that people would necessarily punish state level politicians for a national level policy. And I'm just wondering how you're thinking about that. Again, I mean, now it's different. Like now everything's about Modi, but around 2015, 2016, it's kind of slowly getting there. So I don't know, I was just wondering about like how you conceptualize that.
Yeah, I mean, ideally we would have had access to more national elections that, that happened maybe soon after demonetization that could be matched well to districts. I mean, this is looking at state elections, not an answer to your question, but looking at state elections is more common in the literature just because of the data constraints. That's really the reason. It's not because it's, conceptually better to look at in any way. Maybe we could possibly do more to look at voting behavior state versus national. I mean, I know that CSDS has other surveys. They do the pre-poll and post-poll surveys before every national state election, and they do ask questions on state versus national, their views on elections and who they voted for. That's something I could
And
look
views on
at.
Modi.
Yeah, and views on, do they ask in all the elections?
They were in the one that followed
Okay,
the
I
but
see.
yeah, we wanted to do before that.
Yeah, because the mood of the nation is a different one. It wasn't a pre-post poll, it was just like a
No, it
special
wasn't.
thing
Yeah.
in May. 2017. I mean, I don't have a very satisfactory answer for. I mean, I do think people are relatively aligned, but that's not a general fact at all. I mean, if you know the politics of different states. So
There
yeah,
are
I
also
think-
some, sorry,
Yeah,
there
go
are
ahead,
some
yeah.
states that have like simultaneous elections, national and state.
yeah, I mean, I guess,
And me.
yeah. I mean, to look, maybe poll whatever, because constituencies are fully nicely in
Mhm.
parliamentary constituencies. One could look at how correlated these things are. They are fairly, at least that's one of the reasons we looked at coalition as well. I think that's actually important. But yeah, we could probably do more. But I don't think there's a huge misalignment between these two things. And the national election results that we have are kind of consistent. I mean, depending on how you assign districts to parliamentary constituencies, it gets worse or better with attrition. Yeah. I think you have.
Tanya had a
Yeah.
question.
So, you mentioned that you choose your fixed effects as well as a robustness check.
Which one?
Your fixed effects.
No, we have your fixed effects, and as a robustness check, we additionally had district fixed effects and state by year fixed effects.
So, did you see a difference in like the years because you have elections going from 2017 to 2018? So, did you see like a shift between these 2 years? That's like making public opinion evolve.
I see. So your question is like, what were the effects like over time? We now have done that in our referee responses. It's very hard because there's not so many elections afterwards. And so what we did is we grouped, so after demonetization, we have approximately 18 months. We grouped 6 months of elections, 6 months of elections, 6 months of elections, and these 3. And we looked, and in non-stronghold, the way we've defined it, the effects stay. In stronghold, there's a slight electoral effect, but it's basically totally zero, second and third period. Yeah, so that's and that's actually really interesting. I mean, if we can extend this, that would be really interesting to look at how quickly things go away, because the economic effects indeed were, other things started becoming more top of mind.
Yeah, because also like from just memories from that time, it was like an evolving narrative that why monetization happened, and there was an evolution how people thought of it as well. So I thought this might try out that there would be a difference in how electoral outcomes change.
Yeah.
People were like less convinced.
Yeah, and it's not the case that the stronghold, so for sure what we see, at least in what we've been able to do, it is not the case that stronghold started responding later. They did not, in the way we define strongholds. Yeah.
So following up on that question of the evolution of the narrative and the dynamics of the time, I'm wondering if we know anecdotally or more systematically if there was any kind of compensation that especially strongholds were getting for the effects.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we have tried to look at that now. So one thing we can do, which we have done, is extend the nightlights data just to see if broadly, economically, there's any differences in stronghold areas. At least in the months we looked at, there wasn't. We looked at Narega, jobs, people work, things like that. There was nothing on that. We couldn't think of maybe we looked at, I think banking, like loans received, that data. We didn't see anything different in stronghold areas. If you have other ideas and other things we can look at, we certainly could. But Narega is the biggest one, and also of course credit access.
So thanks a lot. That was really interesting. So just a couple of quick questions. One, I just want to underscore that I don't think my understanding of populism, this is not populist because nobody knew about it. Like there's no basis for thinking it was popular. It could be then made popular through the leader. So just to support that, I think you have a lot here and you don't need that, and that will become a red herring.
Okay.
So just second, I wanted to just come to this coalition's finding, because if I'm reading it correctly, it's that so the BJP alone versus the coalition. I'm just trying to think of what's happening with the coalition partners and the allies, and why is that effect seeming like it's stronger than a BJP alone effect, and how that then affects our interpretation of not just stronghold, but what's driving this. Like, why would it be, if that's the logic, That if I'm interpreting that correctly. So we haven't really talked about the coalition finding vis-a-vis the BJP finding. So how do you guys think about that?
Yeah, so it's possible that this has something to do with the point raised of state versus national. I don't really know how to impact. I mean, I can make some guesses on why.
But it
this
is
might
a
be
stronger
the case.
effect with when it's BJP plus ally.
Yeah,
that is
it
correct,
is.
right?
Yeah, that
I
is
think
correct.
I think
Yeah.
at least
Yeah.
again to the degree that this is how you. I think it only matters because of how you're interpreting it. It's not about the but. I think it does matter because if you're invoking this idea of stronghold and these very fixed partisan, then that doesn't make me think that the allies will be the ones who are driving the results, right? Like if the model in the mind are these fixed partisans who suddenly become fixed onto this charismatic leader, then that doesn't really square with the ally versus BJP result to me. And so I think it does need to be unpacked at that level for interpretation. I'm trying to think, off the top I can't think how to do it, but yeah, does that make sense?
Totally does. I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, what might, so on the ground, how the demonetization was being explained by a BJP person versus an ally. And then I think this is also somewhat, the differences are also a little bit sensitive to whether you code up a party, not feeling a candidate as a zero or not, which can also make a bit of a difference. But you're right, I mean, there's probably stuff to unpack here that we have not at all done in the paper. Yeah, this is similar somehow, but yeah, the vote shares for sure. Yeah.
So when you do only BJP, you have more observations than when you do BJP or ally?
Yeah, because we had some trouble in coding up all of the parties. For some, we were not sure. But if we make the sample the same, it's fairly robust. I mean, it's not very different. Yeah.
So no, that's it.
I just have a clarification. I'm sorry, I can't read most of your analysis, but when you said that severely impacted regions, which are also unbanked regions, reacted poorly, right? But if there were strongholds, they continue to react as they forgive the populist policy. So what is sort of do you know the intersection between bankable regions versus BJP strongholds? Because I would imagine like urban centers, middle class, formalized sector, which also support like BJP, by the way, would also be banked, right? So do you know?
I see. I don't remember what the correlation was. I mean, so the stronghold things that we're looking, we're basically seeing among strongholds. If you just, focus on stronghold districts around the cutoff before and after, like that's the comparison we're making. So it's within that group.
Right.
But it's possible that there are some correlations between, being a stronghold and other characteristics.
Right.
Yeah.
Just a comment to help you start to parse this.
Yeah.
One thing that this suggests to me, given the difference is much larger in the top than in the bottom, is that the vote share change is really happening in places where it is a strong win, which is kind of an interesting finding, right? Because otherwise you'd be flipping a lot more of the probabilities of winning for people who are under margin. And so what that's telling you, I think, is that these effects are biggest, the vote share part for the ally is biggest in these places where they're already doing well, the allies are already doing well. So maybe it has to do with how it's interpreted, the policy is interpreted as being an ally of the party that just did something crazy in those places where you already really believe in that party. I don't know enough about politics. Politics.
Okay, yeah.
But I think this gives you some context to think about where it's happening, which might tell you.
No, definitely. I mean, I think that's a really interesting question that's been brought up that I need to think a lot more, like the effect size difference. Yeah, but that's a possibility.
Could I ask just a question that basically comes out of very lay familiarity with this demonetization policy, which is, where does the fact of socio-economic diversity of the voters appear in this project, in the sense of, does it matter whether someone is a middle class or a poor or a rich, or does it matter whether someone has a history of party affiliation or what we might call as ideological factors, or do these factors
matter in the electoral response?
Yes.
I don't know, so we haven't looked at that. We could. We would have to cut the data more essentially to try and get, so we don't have like voter level data, but you could get some measure of what fraction is socioeconomically worse off and look at the heterogeneity that way. Yeah.
You could potentially look at like SC/ST constituents. I mean,
Yeah.
that's again shrinking the sample, but like that's an easy way that doesn't require survey data. You
Yeah.
can look at and see if the
Yeah.
values are different.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true. I mean, just looking at the correlates of support, I was
Yeah.
like, okay, this is not correlating with things
Mhm.
that you would expect on social. I mean, yes, on on ideological grounds, but not so much on we looked at other things like occupation and other things, and just because of that, we didn't go so much into the heterogeneity of electoral effects, just because the correlates were just so unexpected and not along the lines one would think. But that is something that we could do, and that's something that we don't, have enough. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Just one, then just I'll ask it since we're at time, and I'm genuinely curious. You guys refer to it, and the thing is that 2 years ago I saw a presentation on a paper which you guys mentioned that has like a completely the opposite finding and also looks at a banking reform, an earlier
That's my
banking
colleague,
reform.
right?
I know your colleague Nikhil, and I'm not asking you to say whose is better or anything, but as a genuinely interested observer, I want to know how do we I mean, if we're interested in what was the effect of
Yes.
prior banking reforms, or it's kind of the elephant in the room for me, which is I want to know kind of how to think about this. Like, is there, is it about kind of, obviously they have a slightly different methodological approach. They're looking at a different banking reform. I'm sure you guys have talked about this, but can you give us some like preview of like what do we do with this like when we leave the room? Like how do we kind of square that circle?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm obviously completely biased. I believe myself.
No,
Put
I
it out
should be.
there. But I'll tell you why.
But just like intellectually, what do you think is going on there with that?
Yeah, so the first is the sample. So the huge differences in sample variation, that shouldn't make a difference to the answer to the research question, of course. But it does, because here we have, I mean, it's RDD, difference in discontinuity. It is not all of the districts in India. But in that case, I think it's 75 districts. It's just one part of the country, far fewer districts. But importantly, the policy that they're using is from the 70s and 80s. And this policy, we believe, just flipped that variation, right? So the districts, and this is used in the Burgess and Pandey paper, the districts that had fewer banks as a result of the old policy were exactly the ones that had a lot more here. So it's literally the opposite. So it's not a surprise to me, even with 75 districts, because they would have the opposite result. Yeah.
Okay. So
I think that's what's going on,
Yeah.
but I don't. That's.
Okay. Thanks
So
for
I do
indulging the
believe my
question.
results.
No, that's okay. Thanks for indulging the question. I was just
Yeah.
curious because I was
Yeah,
reading it and I
that's
was like, okay, I just need to, I have to ask, and then I was like, if we're over time, I think I can ask. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.